When I say Kashmir, what are the other words associated to Kashmir that come to your mind? Maybe Article 370, 35A, insurgency, terrorism. Well, it is a tragedy that amongst these words we do not have AFSPA, or the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a central law, maybe a preventive detention law, which gives armed forces special powers and which has been imposed in Kashmir since 1990. The more tragic thing about our discourse is that any discourse, any discussion around AFSPA is mostly anti-army or anti-AFSPA. We never talk about the mental trauma or the mental stress that the armed personnel have to go through because of AFSPA, because they are fighting in Kashmir, and this is all due to the lack of political will and democratic processes, which is the job of our so-called politicians. It is said that AFSPA gives the army special powers, the license to do whatever they want, which is true. But it is also important to talk about the compulsion that the army has while stationed in Kashmir since 1990 and the mental stress they go through. So therefore, in this video, let's understand what AFSPA, what the Armed Forces Special Powers Act is, why it is so draconian, and what should have been done and which has not been done yet. My name is Ishan Fauzdar, and you are watching The Upfront. The Armed Forces Special Powers Act is a central law, as I previously mentioned, which can be imposed in an area which is declared disturbed area by an appropriate authority such as the governor of the state. Now, once imposed, this act, the objective of this act is very simple. It gives the armed forces, the armies, an extra layer of protection so that they can fight terrorism and insurgency with a higher degree of efficiency and lower degree of risk. Section 4 of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act gives the army or empowers the army to arrest, search, and even shoot on suspicion. That is, the army can carry out search and cauldron operations which have been very destructive and controversial. Kunan Pushpora, the case of Kunan Pushpora is an apex example. The army even has the power to arrest on suspicion without a warrant, and it can even shoot down a person whom it suspects to be a militant or a terrorist, everything on suspicion. So the golden criminal dictum of innocent until proven guilty is totally abjected or destroyed under this law. Section 6 of this act give Section 6 of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act mentions that any person that is taken into custody by the armed forces should be handed over to the nearest police station within the shortest possible delay, least possible delay. Now, what does least possible delay amount to in legal terms? Nothing, absolutely nothing, unless you write 30 days, 15 days, or any particular time bound amount in law. It does not mean anything, and therefore this least possible delay has ended up being stretched to years, a month, or even decades, and this has led to forced disappearances in Kashmir. By far, the most important and the most controversial section of this act is Section 7, which gives the armed personnel immunity from being prosecuted. And according to this section, prosecution against armed personnel can only be carried out with the consent of central government. Now, the AFSPA has been under severe criticism, and the consequences of it can be seen in terms of numbers. Numbers are obviously never representative of the psychological stress that a civilian or an army person goes through, but they are nevertheless important. In 2018, AFSPA led to 191 cases of excessive use of force, and cases in which force may not have been could have been avoided, but still they were used. The use of force on civil demonstrator has been really high, and in 2018, 586 people were killed. 586 people were killed in Kashmir, out of which 160 were innocent civilians. They had nothing to do. They were termed as collateral damage. The most interesting and the most disturbing figure of this is that in 2018, around 20 armed personnel, around 20 armed personnel claimed their lives, committed suicide in Kashmir, which is the highest in the last decade. And this number is representative of the emotional and mental stress that AFSPA exerts on the armed forces. AFSPA is I am not sidelining the fact that the armed forces have used AFSPA in a very draconian manner, and that the lives of innocent civilians have been lost. That fact is very much there, but we also need to acknowledge that the armed forces are not there because they want to. The armed forces are there because the political will is to put them there, and this has exerted a negative impact on them as well, which is resulting in suicides, and the rate is high, rising every year. It is very evident and it can be seen that AFSPA is a very draconian and stringent measure, and it was originally brought in as a contingency plan. Contingency plan, as in AFSPA was brought in so that the army could take control of the state and reduce the numbers of insurgents and terrorists. And then the politicians had to take over to democratize Kashmir. The army cannot democratize area. It is the job of the politicians. But because AFSPA has been there since 1990, there has been no democratic processes in Kashmir. Elections have been rigged. There has been continuous presidents and governors rule, and it is the fault of the politicians who have not initiated political dialogue in Kashmir. AFSPA hurts the very fabric of democracy, and it has been scrutinized over and over by the Apex Court, by the Supreme Court of India. In a 2016 landmark judgment, the Supreme Court said that the indefinite deployment of armed forces in the name of establishing normalcy would mock at our democratic processes. Now, this was a case regarding AFSPA in Manipur. In the entire northeastern area, AFSPA is still imposed, but it is this judgment is very much relevant to Kashmir as well, because AFSPA is abolishment of every democratic ideal we ever thought of. Dr. Manmohan Singh in 2004 created a committee to scrutinize AFSPA and to replace it with and promised to replace it with a more humane law, humane quote unquote humane law. But that promise has been forgotten. That promise was forgotten by the UPA government. It has been equally forgotten by the NDA government, by the BJP-led NDA government. And the more disturbing fact is that the government claims that the AFSPA should never be removed and will never be removed, and that no one has the power to remove AFSPA. These are the kind of statements that we have heard even after defunctionalization of 370, which was quote unquote the breakage of the spine cord of terrorism in Kashmir. Still AFSPA is very much there in Kashmir, and still there is no political dialogue, and the rationale behind this move is still unfounded. If you like this video, if you like our other videos, do go and like those videos. Share this video with your friends and family so they understand what AFSPA is and how dangerous it is. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and press the bell icon so as to receive an update on whenever we upload a new video.